Yeah.
I mean, unbelievable array of people. They had Mark Twain. They had William James, the psychologists. They had the Falcon Wagnalls people, the people from Webster. They had people
Holy
from
cow.
the encyclopedias.
Holy cow.
The most noted writers in America. Published.
So this was the 1880s.
1880s. By 1906, they had distilled down to these are the 300 words. If we could shift the spelling of these words,
how interesting.
it would shift the language in the right direction. 20-something years. Now, they're following on the heels of Ben Franklin, who had invented a new alphabet everybody thought was nuts except Webster. Webster dedicates all of his work to Franklin for inspiring.
Interesting.
Webster goes to the direction of spelling, and on his deathbed says, I was wrong, we had to fix the alphabet. So anyway, all this going on in the background while phonics and whole language stuff have been warring over here, there's been another camp that's been saying, wait a minute, there's something wrong with the code.
Yes, interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
So it reached its zenith in 1906 when the then president of what Dewey had started, Brander Matthews, who's the president of the head of the English department at Columbia.
Yeah, that's a familiar name, yeah.
Happens to be a friend of Theodore Roosevelt, and goes to Theodore Roosevelt and tells him about this. Roosevelt, despite having a photographic memory, he could recall
no
pages
kidding.
of books.
No kidding.
He had photographic recall, but he couldn't spell very well. Right? So this thing really grips him, and he gets it. He says, I agree with this. So he issues an executive order to the Office of Government Printing to immediately begin to print everything this way. Well, this happens when Congress is out of session. Congress comes back from session and says, wait a minute, presidents can't do this. And it gets involved with the Supreme Court. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, we ain't touching
What
it.
a story.
Oh, it's a great story. There's a number of these kind of stories.
Holy cow.
So finally what happens is the enemies of Theodore Roosevelt, political enemies, in conspiracy with a number of the major newspapers, including a major newspaper here in Boston, basically put on a smear campaign that says this whole thing is just a dirty scheme of jobbery in order to make Carnegie a bunch of money on the reprinting of all the books involved. And a stink comes over the whole idea of orthographic reform that they've never recovered from.
How interesting. How interesting. Wow.
To the extent that, Roosevelt was accused of playing God to change the spelling to political cartoons with him shooting a gun at the dictionary. Really.
While Shakespeare and every people behind the dictionary.
And Chaucer, ghost form.
It's
incredible.
It's like the Chancery Scribe story, which Vinesky put me on to. And I went and interviewed John Fisher, who was the guy that ferreted out, by comparison of manuscripts, in the 1400s, the point of emergence of standardized English.
Yeah, I saw that in the Vinesky interview.
Well, if that travels to the John Fisher interview, where basically, a king of England broke the spell of the French, you might say. And him and his small band of scribes, the scribes, of course, were trained in Latin, spoke Latin, thought English was a peasant language. They're the ones that actually developed the writing system that would be the kind of seed crystal for the writing system we use today.
Wow.
So there's some significant part of the problem that we face that has to do with the fact that it's just not natural in general, regardless of how clean it was as a code. Some of it has to do with the fact that it's a messy code. There's a story of historical negligence unfolding. And then there's a series of other factors, and we're trying to go across the whole span.
Yeah, sure. How interesting. And then there's, you got into it a little bit in the Vinesky interview. There's this sort of, as you pointed out, I think that there's 200 years of people saying, but yeah, we preserve the meaning. The morphology sticks in a way that it wouldn't if we all started spelling like Esperanto or something. So yeah, that's an interesting.
That serves the speed reader. That serves somebody who's able to recognize these cells, these patterns, and use them to leverage and pick up words that they wouldn't understand the meaning of without, even though it's confusing to pronunciation.
Well, also serves cross-linguistic stuff because, say, like speakers of Romance languages can recognize Latinate roots in a way that they might not.
Right. But it doesn't help the struggling beginners.
No, certainly not. Well, also I think that's one. Maybe we can get into it, but that's one of the interesting things. Is that Benita Blackman asks the question of how much phonemic awareness do you need, which is not asked enough. Dick used to ask that question too, and my mentor, Gene Chall, And the interesting thing is, it partly depends on what alphabet you're asking people to read. So the people who are reading a more transparent orthography, an alphabet where there's a greater correspondence, probably need less. And so people can learn to read pretty well in Spanish or Serbo-Croatian by working with onset and rhyme. So Spanish reading sort of takes a vowel sound like ah for a, and then they just go ba, ka, la, etc., 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 and that takes you well through that orthography, and there's very little else you need to know.
Right.
It's really pretty cool.
So the kind of distinctions that are made in the acquisition of the oral language will map over without as much convolution.
And that abstraction that it takes to understand what's a phoneme and that it's this little artificial thing that we use in this technology. So
now, one of the interesting things is we track this back to, you know, with the original Semitic alphabet, there's no vowels. That's all meant to, you know, that's the user's thing. It's going to lift and separate and imbue it with that. And then the Greeks, when they get it, say, wait a minute, this is missing. We don't concretize this. But at that point, as Plato once said, you know, if we learned the letters of the alphabet, we could read. Reading was a code-cued speech. Boom, boom, boom. Spread it, blend it together, and you go. This internal assembly required
some assembly required.
Yeah, that's a recent phenomenon. That's a consequence of the collision between this original Latin alphabet sound system and the English sound system, and the fact that nobody was minding the store when these things fused. Yeah,
I think that's a good way to put it.
So it's a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, certainly.
Squeeze us in.
Yeah, my pleasure too. Yeah.
How do you come to this? I mean, what is it? How do you mentioned your mentor, Gene Shaw. I mean,
that
touched you and has brought you to be on the forefront of adult literacy?
Well, I think, you know, looking back on it, there's always been a sort of defective gene for education in our family. My parents were teachers, and a couple of my aunts and uncles are teachers, and one of my children is showing dangerous inclinations in that direction. But I really came to it very indirectly, and that seems to be true of a lot of people in adult literacy. We don't have this sort of direct route that people in K-12 education have. So I was one of those 60s radicals who kept plugging away. I was a labor and community organizer in Chicago in the 70s and into the early 80s. And at some point they were closing factories faster during that Rust Belt recession than we could organize people into unions and different little radical caucuses. So I said, well, I guess I should go back to graduate school. And in those days, Robert Coles, whom I'd known from college, said, well, why don't you go back to the Ed school? There's a lot of good stuff going on there. And I came back thinking I was going to get involved in history of education, and then ended up taking a course with Chal and saying, this is kind of interesting. And also looking back on it, it's a way for me to stay in touch with that population I got so interested in the labor movement. Working class people, working poor, and so forth. And I didn't notice when I used to work in the factory. Looking back on it, there were a lot of people who were perfectly bright, but if I'd known, back then I would have said, gee, that person might be dyslexic because of how they couldn't handle print. So it's very interesting. People would, you'd give them a leaflet saying where a meeting was going to be, and they wouldn't be able to find it. So stuff like that used to happen. It's very interesting.
Very rarely did they say, oh, excuse me, I am having difficulty reading this.
Exactly. Much less, because they wouldn't have, I wouldn't have understood back then, and they would have been way too embarrassed to admit it. Yeah.
Which is a key impediment to their
Absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So.
Oh, and then when I got back here, so Chal got me interested in reading, and a woman named Sylvia Green, who still teaches at the Community Learning Center here in Cambridge, our main adult ed center, came in to give a guest presentation in one of the classes, and then I did an observation in her class, and I said, this is for me. She was teaching a bunch of beginning readers, and it was inspiring and interesting. You never get it right. It's hard to do, so it keeps you interested. You never get reading figured out, so it's fun.
And that makes sense. So you did have a care and a connection for a certain less than fully franchised community, and saw that both had a political dimension and also this fundamental reading component that was part of what enables or disables their level of participation. I mean, you kind of
yeah, absolutely. I mean, like Brecht said, "Hungry man, pick up a book." I always felt that in work in the labor movement and then later in education that people's access to print was very, very important. There are just some things they're never going to make a movie about for you.
Yeah, in addition to the information access, what it does
absolutely
for you to exercise that kind of cognitive exercise, what that means.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, to struggle and try to figure out what somebody's saying and where you agree and where you disagree. I think that human beings are born with curiosity and the ability to think critically, but they need material in order to do that. And reading seems to provide it in a way maybe that other activities don't. So it's, except possibly conversation of a certain kind. So anyway, I'd always felt that it was important, and that that the smarter, in sort of crude terms, people were, the more they would be able to shape their own destinies.
So you've been involved in adult literacy then for...
Gosh, I started in 1983 teaching part-time, and I taught at this place, the Community Learning Center, for 11 years. Big center, it serves a cross-section of people. Cambridge is a very sort of, in those days more than now, but still today, a mixed community and literally polyglot, people from all over the world, a lot of different languages. A big English as a second language program, and a variety of adult basic ed students. So it was like my second graduate school. There was and still is a talented group of teachers there who brought me along, took someone who knew some theory and helped him to become a better teacher.
And an ideal learning lab, all these different variations of the struggle that you have to deal with.
Yes, and that's, in a way, that's the way my work has gone. It's tried to look at variation among adult learners.
I had a really dark strip coming down over here that was bugging me.
No, just put the pause there. Wait, gotta fix something.
That's fine. And I think that, and the other thing was that at the same time I was doing that, given that adult educators make so little money, and I have 3 children, I was doing a lot of extra jobs and also working on my doctorate here. But one of my extra jobs was to run the Harvard Adult Reading Lab when it used to be taught in the extension school. So that was another way to work with this population and also help to train the teachers. It was a lab practicum to help to train the teachers. So that was a great opportunity too. And I still teach that course today in the Graduate School of Education. That's basically how to teach reading to adults.
So let's. It seems to me that's what we want to be talking about, right? We're going to move into that field.
Sure.
If there's anything else that you'd like to speak to about your history before we get to that point that stands out, some insight that was provoked by a particular experience, something that really nailed you?
I would say just exposure to diagnostic assessment and diagnostic teaching through CHAW, and Mary Beth Curtis was also the associate director of the lab when I was being trained. So the idea that you can give a number of diagnostic tests to a person and have a feeling then, more than a feeling, a very good indication of where to begin the teaching and what their strengths and needs are. As Charles used to put it, it's the kind of assessment and teaching you would normally get only if you were rich. So if someone of means had a reading difficulty as an adult, they could go to Mass General and have a wonderful tutor work with them and do assessment on their strengths and needs, and then plan lessons that were exactly right for them. So that insight has made me want to extend that kind of treatment to the population at large. Even though the adult education system in the U.S. is underfunded chronically. And the other thing that it's worked into is my research. What my research has done over the last 8 years or so is to take those individual assessments, they're sort of clinical assessments in word recognition and phonics and oral reading and oral vocabulary and comprehension and stuff, to take those kinds of assessments and give them to large numbers of people, both in the US and now they're giving it a shot in Canada, to have a sense what the profile of strengths and needs is for an entire population, to help governments and educators make decisions about what kinds of needs these people over here have and what would it take to meet them and how close are these people to a level of functioning that would really change their lives.
So is this an instrument that you developed yourself?
No, these are all pretty much off the shelf.
Of instruments
That's
that allow
right.
you to create
A profile.
pattern of profile.
Exactly.
Of a subpopulation. That
That's
can
right.
actually
That's right.
inform,
That's right. Yeah.
policy.
Yeah. So, and it seems to work well when you combine it with the kind of adult assessment that's done in the international adult literacy studies, the ones that were done in the U.S. and the other OECD countries. It seems to be combined well with that. So I've been working with Erwin Kirsch and some of his colleagues at ETS, as well as with the Canadians, on how this can be translated, and we can make some inferences about the actual reading needs of this population, other than just saying that they stand here on the IELTS test, the international test, and they ought to be here. Well, what keeps them from getting there?
So what are the subcomponent skill definitions?
Yes, exactly. It's just straight old-time components teaching.
So the pivotal insight, going back to that, your training, was that, gee, this isn't this amorphous, fuzzy thing. There is a substructure that we can get handles on that can help us tune instruction and policy to better serve the people that need help. Yeah,
and also there may be sort of tipping points in key skills, like key components like word recognition and vocabulary, that once you get over that hump, you can become a more independent reader, and if you're an adult, a lifelong learner who from then on can use reading, as Charles used to say, to learn the new, which is really where we're aiming for, that kind of independence and kind of strength on the part of individuals. So if you lose your job, you can go to community college and learn something new. If you want to help your kid with his homework, you can do those things. If you want to participate more in civic stuff, you've got the basic skill levels to enable you to take off and do it.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've been talking to people at Goodwill that are dealing with adults that are they've become disabled through some accident or other.
Yes.
And that what they've come to realize is that the biggest problem in getting them retooled and off into another, career trajectory is reading.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Time and again, that's where, especially physical laborers that get hurt and they want to move to something else.
That's very common. That's right, and it's very, very common. A lot of my students, when I was an adult literacy teacher, were construction workers who were making a very good living and then threw their back out and couldn't recover and had to take up a new career. And that was certainly true during my time in the labor movement when factories were closing. People who had the ability to make a great living by working a lot of overtime in a union plant to own a second house possibly and put their kids through college, suddenly didn't have the requisite skills to sort of go back and retrain at midlife, to take up something new, computers or real estate or sales or something else they might like to do when the factory jobs disappeared.
This is one of the reasons we particularly like to think of literacy as letter transparency, as if the whole writing system has become transparent, just like our mechanism of oral language exchange is transparent to what sharing mean, right? We just move through it.
It happens, yeah.
We're not caught up in the mechanics of it to the degree that it's stuttering or slowing us down from participating in what it all means.
Absolutely. When it's going right, reading is a seamless process, almost as if the book is talking to you. In fact, it's you really talking through the book. It's what's going on is probably pretty complicated.
I like to think of this part as a player piano, right? The phonemes are like keys on the piano. They make distinct sounds. And that the code has to play play those so as to create this kind of internally heard speech, at least initially, and that there's a relationship between whether or not all the sound parts are there, whether they can all move fast enough together, and whether or not the code can play them in such a way that results in something that makes sense. Yeah,
well, the metaphor code is a great one. I don't know. I associate it with Phil Goff and Tunmer and some of those researchers, and Samuels and Labarge and stuff from the 70s. But it really captures that aspect of it. Yeah, it's a code that triggers the creation of natural language somehow in our heads. Yeah.
If we have been trained appropriately to have
yes.
the infrastructure,
yes.
like the player piano mechanism,
yep.
that can take the input from the code and generate, virtualize, simulate
yes.
language stream.
Yes. Well, and also what we can simulate is remarkable. Marilyn Adams and I talk about this a lot, just for fun. But we, of course, as we can read faster than we can talk, most of us, and we can also regularly impart voice when we're reading. To the stuff we're reading. If someone's sarcastic, we can impart a sarcastic voice and so forth. We can impart drama. We can also, it turns out that people in all languages, even as you'd expect, even in logographic languages like Chinese that are represented that way, that we do pauses in our silent reading at syntactic boundaries. And also that we are subvocalizing, which years ago they used to tell us, don't do that, that's bad. But it turns out we really are hearing a voice in our heads, but it's running at a higher speed than we could possibly understand if it were coming in from the outside. It's virtual reality. Yeah.
And the challenge is that, whereas, as you said, for most of us, we're able to read faster than we speak. Once we're through the barrier.
That's right. That's right. And that's the thing.
For the most of us that are having difficulty, you say that this whole assembly process is taking longer than the output stream. It's taking too long to create an output stream that's moving at the pace of speech. Because speech is moving at an incredible rate.
That's right. That's right. Well, and also, as you say, I don't know if there's new research on this, but I know that Chal and Vinesky always used to feel that the child doesn't really switch over and find reading a better way to get information than oral language until well through middle school, possibly as late as 7th or 8th grade. You can see what Rayner thinks about that and some of the people who've been tracking that more closely, more recently. But so it does take a while for that system to get set up. And that's one of the things that interests me. If someone is close, if an adult is close to having the system set up in terms of their word recognition and their ability to access vocabulary, and if they have there must be some also, we think, base level of vocabulary that opens up print to you, which gives you enough words so that you can make good guesses about the unknown words in a passage, vocabulary words. Are there sort of base levels that you need to know and that get you to that point where the machine is kind of on its own and it's self-starting, and the term that they use now a lot, I associate it with Sabatini, but other people, it's recursive. The more you do it, the better you get, and all of the aspects start feeding back into it. The more you read, the better you spell. Yeah. Yeah, it's the Matthew effect running positively. That's right. Yeah.
Right, it's distinct from the other side, which is what happens when you start to have a negative affective response to the feeling of the confusion, and the downward spiral.
Exactly, and
eats this up.
And those are my students, the people for whom this process hasn't come together, and it's an incredible limiting aspect to your life.
One of the points that we're really trying to get to is that, and when we talk with teachers and we kind of share some of the work that's in progress of what we're doing right now in seminars and what have you, it's pretty amazing how few people understand that the shame, the negative affective response to the confusion overwhelm is actually cognitively dissipative.
I can't imagine it wouldn't be, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Consuming what's necessary to get through the confusion.
Yeah.
So it becomes a negative downward spiral that in that sense is as cognitively important as all the other things we pay attention to, even though we normally consider it to be an emotional thing that's on the side.
You can definitely see it in students who, adult students who may have had 20, 30, 40 years of struggling with this issue, and you can see them, just see it in their faces and how they present. They just start to tense up. And you know that even though they're in a situation where you're teaching them one-on-one, nobody else is looking, and they know that what they're doing will help them, that they still tense up over some of those, you've got to feel, old feelings from when they were a child. It takes them back to those awful experiences they must have had.
That affective wiring is so primitive and so powerful. I mean, it's what's directing what's happening cognitively. It's so powerful. We heard a story the other day from a number of stories. I mean, one of the things we do is collecting stories about the shame side of this. About this thing, it's just so vivid. This little boy, 6 years old, being in a classroom full of other kids, and he notices that there's a deaf kid who can't read. He can't read. Well, deaf kid can't read. Nobody's blaming him. Nobody's shaming him. It's okay that kid can't read. So he starts to pretend that he's deaf.
Sure.
He carries this on for months and months and months. Test after test. His parents take him to the hospital. Doctors. Finally, they put him in the hospital for 4 days to go through exploratory ear surgery. And he knows that he's 6 years old. He knows all the way that this is a whole phony farce just to hide the fact that he can't read.
Oh my goodness.
Surgery rather than admit it.
Oh my goodness.
And it's so typifying. You wouldn't believe how many people talk to that connects for adults that we met, like at Goodwill and what have you, that have grown up feeling like they're a waste of breath.
Yeah, actually, I just thought of an example of how that affect, that early negative affect, as you referred to it, kind of slows you down, even though you are getting sometime later in your life the right help. One of the common things that children must conclude when they're struggling with reading, you can imagine a little kid sitting in class and everybody else is reading relatively fast and picking it up pretty fast. And so they think to be a good reader is to be fast, and they develop a context guessing strategy because maybe if they're having trouble with decoding, that's the only way they can maintain the rate of speed that they see the other kids doing. And it's very, very difficult to get them to back off of that speed and reattend to some of the underlying structure that they need to practice more and get better at. It's hard enough when they're little kids, much less by the time we get them when they're adults. They also do things like, this is an odd thing that my colleague Roz Davidson and I found looking at some isolated word recognition testing on 1,000 adults in our population. What we found was that the native speakers in our population, people most of whom grew up in the U.S., and we knew from questionnaire reports and stuff that they had done for us, many of whom are reading disabled and had been in special education and extra help when they were kids and stuff. When they read isolated word lists, just random words on a list arranged by difficulty, the kinds of mistakes they make are guessing mistakes about the first shape of the word rather than mistakes that reflect an attempt to sound the word out. No surprise, we'd seen that before. The interesting thing that we found was that if you gave them a test of pseudo words, where it's much harder to come up, and they know these aren't real words, so it's much harder to come up with a real word substitution, they were okay. They weren't great at pseudo words, but they could actually do a bit of the phonics that it takes and the orthographic processing to pronounce them. But when given real words, even real words out of context, they still went into a guessing strategy. And by contrast, a population at the same level of reading, we matched two groups of people who were ESL students, among whom you would only expect to see perhaps 5% with reading difficulties, more like the normal distribution in the population. In that group, all of their mistakes were just based on decoding, but possibly putting the wrong stress on a word or something like that. But they did much less guessing. So it's a strategy that's so ingrained. And what's frustrating, I think, for teachers is here's a person who actually knows what she or he is supposed to do with the code, but that isn't the preferred strategy because maybe it goes too slowly or it's not reliable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea that we know talking about here are faster than conscious, faster than volitional.
Oh, absolutely.
Reflex.
Absolutely.
When these things misform, it's very difficult to line things back up again.
That's a good way to put it. That's right.
Reshape them.
Yeah. I mean, the only advantage you have with adults that you don't have with little kids anyway is adults have great metacognitive ability. So you can have this same conversation with them that we're having now and say, well, I think you're doing this, and where we'd like to get you is over here because it'll be better for these reasons. And they're willing to work at it the same way you or I might work at a sport like tennis or golf to try to improve how we play. And
now it comes down to whether the teacher can create the right kind of exercise environment that will distinctly act upon the reflex that's askew.
yes, and I think we don't know enough about what that is. That would be a good place to look for more research. And I think that the other thing, though, is a more structural problem just having to do with adult life. It's time. Leaving out all questions of sort of brain plasticity, which are real. I mean, obviously, it's easier for children to acquire certain kinds of skills than it is for adults.
It's clear, though, that the difference isn't the degree to which the shame is impeding the cognitive clarity to continue the exercise.
Excellent point. We don't know that. Yeah, that's right.
Itself having a plastic difference,
Yeah.
plasticity difference.
Maybe less important. Yeah.
With Merznek and others that are into neuroplasticity, I'm inclined to think it's more on the affective side, the cumulative affect. The more people are ashamed of this, the lower the threshold of triggering the shame. The more that it's triggering, the less the cognitive bandwidth to do it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, because even just logically, it makes sense, because otherwise, if we didn't, if us older people didn't have any plasticity, we wouldn't be learning anything day to day. We've obviously got some. It's a question of whether we can access it. That's a good point. But back on the business of how hard it can be, because adults coming back to school, they're not so different from me as a doctoral student. 3 little kids, several jobs. It's very hard to come back to school and put the time into it. It was hard for me, and it's equally hard for them, even if they might just be beginning readers or intermediate readers. They're often working several jobs. They've got family responsibilities. It's hard to find time to practice. It's hard to find time for distributed practice of sub-skills that you want to work on. Just as it might be hard if they wanted to improve their golf swing, if they also have trouble finding time for that.
Golf course to improve my golf swing, but all I have to do is walk out this door and point my head in any direction to see something I can read.
Yeah, but it just can't be anything, because it's what you practice with. It has to be the right level of challenge, and has to be interesting, but that's true. Yeah, but it's just not easy. And I think even if the U.S. and other OECD countries were able to spend more money than we do on adult ed, and clearly we're able to and could, we would still ultimately come up against the limitations of adults' time, given our responsibilities. So that's something to take into consideration. It also, I think, puts a lot of pressure on us researchers in adult teaching and learning to not to mess around and to try to find out the most efficient ways to get people moving and to achieve growth in reading. We just haven't got forever, and we can't sort of go fooling around and say, well, let's try this and let's try that, or let's see what the person would like to do. I feel a lot of pressure to try to be efficient with instruction. And I also feel a lot of pressure to feed back what I'm learning to K-12, because that's the place, at least among native speakers, where we could make huge differences in the number of people coming into adult ed programs. By the time someone comes to us, they've experienced a lot of pain and possibly a lot of damage. So the more we could do earlier, the better. But anyway,
Excellent. There's 2 things I want to cycle back on before we go forward into the more specifics of adult literacy, if I may. One had to do with the pseudo words versus regular words.
yes.
And that was really interesting. So my sense of that, it would be that what we're saying is that because the pseudo word doesn't have a pattern that they can recognize as the takeoff point for their guessing strategy, then they default into the workout.
Yes.
As distinct from a word that starts to take off in some particular.
And they jump on it. Yeah. Yes, that's right. Exactly. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
This is a question that we got asked by a young woman at Goodwill. This incredibly articulate woman who had just been through the ringer. And she says, but what do I do? What have I done to myself here? I'm 35 years old now. I've taught myself all these strategies to try to get through because it's all I can do.
Yes.
I mean, incredible metacognitive ability.
Yes.
In this one. So she's saying, and so I taught myself these strategies to try to get through what I did do. And now I'm realizing that I'm stuck. And I don't know if I've harmed myself more than, but it's what I had to do to survive. And now I'm locked in it. I mean, and she's completely aware of this process and saying, help me.
Yeah. No, thank you.
And it fit right in, and I wanted to share that.
Yeah, I think that's a good example of that. And she sounds very articulate on that point. Yeah. It's, and I think the way you expressed it also, David, is how it felt to us looking, because these were data that we were looking at in aggregate, but we had also done a lot of these interviews and a lot of this testing ourselves. So we'd seen people doing this, and in some ways the numbers just confirmed our clinical observations.
The other thing, speaking of numbers, is you said, well, something, and then something referring to about the same 5% of the population has reading difficulties.
Yeah, well, that's a fuzzy figure. It could be 5, it could be 10. It's a matter of definition. Maybe we're talking, if you think about the people, I don't know what the latest figures are that the Shawitzes et al. Are giving out on the Connecticut longitudinal study, but they keep talking about 5% of the people in that study.
Well, the distinction that
being people,
and Shawitz make, Shawitz talks about the 20%, but if you really work her, it's down to 5.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the group I'm talking about.
That 5% refers to those people that we cannot seem to reach with any instructional methodology, and that therefore we infer may have some neurobiological or structural difficulty as distinct from being an instructional casualty.
That's right.
When we say how many people have reading difficulty, we're talking
That's
100 million people.
That's right. I mean,
an entirely different percentage of the population. I just want to make sure
Well, I guess it's really confusing the way that the terms are used, and you have to kind of fight your way through them. And that's why I use the 5% figure, hypothetically talking about a group of immigrants from a Spanish-speaking country, say. That's what you might expect to see, that number. Just people who have something that would be pretty resistant to teaching and even good remediation. Okay. Maybe, but who knows, maybe fewer in a language with such a Spanish with a more transparent orthography.
Right. The thing that concerns us in all of this is that, I mean, maybe discount NAEP all you want. I mean, once you start to say that anybody who starts to take off to learn to read and does not achieve transparency has been diminished or harmed.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Then most of us are being diminished or harmed.
In the U.S., yeah, that's right.
Most of us.
That would be a way to put it. Another way to put it would be automaticity with word recognition. If that are using that word the same way, or so in other words, where it just, or to get back to the thing, as if the book were talking to you.
Right. That anything less than that means that I may have some kind of a stuttering instrumental skill that I can use, but it's not a fluid medium of transporting meaning in and out of me like oral language is.
That's right.
In this world, in terms of both the cognitive exercise that goes with it, the enablement to be self-directed learning, all those different attributes.
Well, that's
so less than that.
Exactly.
You've been harmed. You've been diminished.
Yeah. Well, and I think we have some evidence for how the sort of word recognition phonological piece fits into that. One of the studies that we're just finishing up looked specifically at adults who scored at level 1 on the IELTS-NALS family of tests. And so those would be folks who, for rough estimate's sake, have a grade 6 and below reading skills in terms of comprehension. We looked at them, and we also looked at people up through level 2 and 3. Level 2 is approximately, the 2-3 break is approximately the break between high school level skills in reading and above.
So that doesn't correspond to the same structure that NIFL uses.
I don't know about NIFL. NAPE has a different structure, but the IELTS is the one that's the 5 levels. It's the testing originally invented at ETS by Kirsch and his colleagues, and then contributed to by a lot of researchers from the OECD countries. It's a real-life literacy tasks ranging from pretty simple, like recognizing the name of a food in a newspaper article, all the way through some reading an editorial and being able to make inferences on it and stuff. There's also math testing that goes with it that tracks reading pretty closely. But what we did was give 1,000 people at levels of literacy from level 1 beginners all the way through upper level 3 and 4. And 3 and 4 starts to get you into college-educated people and so forth. We gave them also some components testing and reading, the same old clinical tests like I've been using and people have been using, like reading teachers like me have been using for years. And what we found was that when they hit levels of proficiency in word recognition and vocabulary on some standardized tests that were sort of, I would say, at the level of upper middle school. It's hard because the tests aren't calibrated this way. But when they hit them at that level, in other words, just kind of pre-high school, that their skills in those components were very close to the skills of proficient readers, like people in levels 4 and 5. In terms of how quickly they could recognize and pronounce words on a test correctly, and the number of basic vocabulary words that they knew. So there are tipping points in some of these sub-skills that seem to enable the strong comprehension that's so critical in developed countries. It's the one that 2-3 line between level 2 readers on the IELTS NALS family of tests and level 3 is a huge watershed for everything from longevity and civic participation and overall health and how much you read for pleasure, and not to mention employment and the ability to find jobs. So it's a real watershed in the society, and of course it's probably changed over time. That watershed was probably further down in my grandfather's time, when it took less literacy to make a good living and have full civic participation and so forth. So it's an interesting phenomenon, and it looks like we can identify those tipping points, and it kind of gives us a target. To get back to your question about the NAPE, David, it kind of gives us a target. Why we should be worried if 4th graders don't have pretty good word recognition and vocabulary. They could be on, as you suggested, on a lifelong path to real difficulties. And that's even leaving out the kids who come from second language homes, limited English proficient homes.
Yeah, as it's homogenized in the aggregated data, we're talking about 88% of Black 4th grade.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
64% of
That's
all
right.
American 12th graders are
That's
below
right.
proficiency.
That's right.
And the adult literacy surveys coming out and saying the numbers are going up. And
Yes.
rather than being in some isolated, easy to dismiss thing, we now have the American Medical Association and the Department of Labor and the people in charge of prisons and the justice system.
Yes.
They're all starting to say, you know what, there's a connection here, and the numbers are big.
Yes, and I think the other thing, too, is that even in the last adult literacy survey, the one that was completed in '93, it was pretty clear that older people had stronger skills than younger people in that sample. And from what you're saying, we may see that when the results come out on the new study, the one that they're just completing this year, that trend may be worse. That something has actually changed for the worse in terms of how well we're preparing kids in these sort of key levels of skill, getting over these humps. When you talk to word recognition researchers, they say, I know someone like, I've certainly heard Joe Torgerson say this, that, and I know it as a clinician, if you can get a person, child or adult, up to the 4th grade hump, that's a lot of the syllable patterns in English. And from then on, if you started to learn those patterns, you can really navigate pretty well. That tipping point is probably much lower in a language with fewer syllable patterns and more regularity, like Spanish. Say, my sense of my data on Spanish readers is that it is more like grade 2 or 3.
This interaction between the confusion and how I feel about the confusion, and both of those things creating this aperture we got to get through.
Yeah, and the other thing too is, I think, to go back to Stannovich's Matthew effects metaphor, for the child from a working class home, a poor home, a non-native English-speaking home, a home where the parents aren't highly literate and using a big-time vocabulary all the time. For a child from those circumstances, school is the main source for vocabulary and background knowledge. But if the code isn't in, then that is not going to come in through print. So it becomes a Matthew effect, so something that starts out as a word recognition difficulty, either because because you're just on the left-hand side of the curve in terms of your phonological ability, so it was harder for you to pick up the code, or whether you're very dyslexic, or whether you just have come from a home where print is not in the environment.
Or there's an impoverished vocabulary, and you don't have
you're not exposed.
All these
yeah.
variables are,
And they're absolutely related, I'm convinced, in the life of the young child. But so you start out just being over at this end of the curve, but by the time it's all over, it's been magnified because you've been exposed to less vocabulary. You have all this negative affect towards school because of the terrible experiences you've had, and that's how we can have young people coming out of high school now with 4th grade reading abilities.
That's precisely the fulcrum point that interests me about the National Center for Family Literacy, in that if we say that that vocabulary is what, oral language vocabulary is what builds the kind of phonemic distinction, frequency, granularity that's necessary to create a good base for taking off in the code.
Yes,
on one hand.
yes.
And on the other hand, that in order to take off and read, we should have 90% of the vocabulary in mind, or whatever it is we're reading, so we're not stretching more than 5 or 10% on the edge of what we're doing.
That's right. That's right.
The vocabulary, which is primarily learned in the home environment, or in the early environment prior to the public education anyway, is critical to how well our children are going to take off in school.
Well, and I think a point you touched on in the first part of what you just said is important too. To the young child, well, let's backtrack a little bit. Think of the definition of the phoneme that a linguist would use. It's the smallest change in sound that leads to a change in meaning. I may have messed that up a little bit, but that's the gist of it. Well, the young child is attending to phonemes because it's important, and it's part of learning and interaction and love in the family and so forth. And so the more exposure you get to phonemes, that exposure is not just sound, it's sound and meaning. So that also can explain one of the things we wonder about, which is, why is it that also this population of kids that has been exposed to less oral language, like documented in the Hart and Risley study, why they not only have fewer vocabulary words when they come to school, but they also have less developed sense of phonemic awareness. Fewer words, fewer phonemes. So you wonder in your head, you say, what happens? Is it the case that the 2 or 3 year old is looking out the window and she points and says, "Mommy, what's that?" And the mommy says, "That's cold rain." And then another mommy says, "Sleet." Well, that little L phoneme in the blend coming in there is a fast one. It goes by real fast in the speech stream. But if the child learns to attend to that phoneme in a meaningful experience with something she's very interested in, then the two things are reinforcing each other. And so that kid, hypothetically, you got to wonder, doesn't she not only come to school with a better vocabulary, she knows what the word sleet is, but for all we know, she's more attentive to phonemes, even the ones that rush by in the initial blends, than the kid who was never exposed to as many words. So I think the two things really come together.
So again, what we're saying is that the vocabulary that children are bathing in, they're growing in, that they're being called to attend to effectively because it's important to who they are
Yes.
in their world.
Yes.
It's meaningful implicitly, is what's driving the differentiation and distinction that we would call phonemic awareness.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so if we're concerned with the majority of the kids that are having trouble taking off and reading, and we say at the bottom of it, it's the vocabulary they need as a back reference and the phonemic awareness that they need in order to process the code, these things are developing in this base environment long before they get to school.
That's right. I agree. And
therefore, we've got to have a different relationship to supporting that part of their environment rather than trying to compensate for them years off the pace.
That's right.
In kindergarten.
And also, I think because it's so expensive, I remember a few years ago when Ed.D. Hirsch called attention to the école maternelle in France and what a good job they were doing with early childhood. And he felt that was one of the reasons why some of the social class differences among French children were less severe than they are among children in the U.S. and other countries, because all kids were getting this wonderful experience with highly trained teachers who had a language curriculum and a play curriculum and all the things that we know make up a really good early childhood experience for children. And you know, congressmen and governors and state legislators and so forth went over and took junkets to take a look, and it turns out it's very expensive. And we've kind of leaned more in the direction of looking for silver bullets. And one of them is phonemic awareness. If we only did more phonemic awareness with young children, I'm for it. And I think the evidence for its effectiveness is pretty good. And we should do it. But where you really want to see it is taking place in a very language-rich environment. So it doesn't do to take people who don't have good oral language skills themselves, unfortunately, like many of the people who actually provide the childcare for our children, and simply teach them a few phonemic awareness games and think that that will help children from a somewhat diminished early language environment to catch up. It'll be okay for the phonemic awareness, and I think the results are demonstrable. But if you wanted to go the full court press route, you really need a rich environment. You need parents and other caregivers who are using words and doing language activities with kids that continue to stretch their horizons.
Which comes back, I think, that's an excellent way to put that. Like in our conversation with Louisa Moats, one of my favorite things, it's very simple. I mean, our society just doesn't get it. Our society doesn't get it. We don't understand how important this is. I mean, this is and if you would agree with this, I mean, I've taken Wendorf and people with learning disabilities right up to the edge of this in our conversation. When you think of how important this is and how many people are struggling with it, this is the nation's greatest learning disability.
And it's not going to get better. And also the people who worry about competition compare us with countries like China where they're making a much more unified effort with less to work with in terms of resources.
Law that they're all going to learn English.
There you go. The other point I wanted to make about that, it really has to do, to bring it back a little bit, to how all this connects in a way to adult literacy. When you look at we're one of the countries that has great top-end literacy. People come from all over the world to study at our universities, and well, they should. And we're as good, if not better, than any other country in the world at the top end. We're not too bad in the middle, but we have one of the biggest gaps between high and low literacy of any of the developed countries, possibly one of the biggest of the OECD countries, compared to the Netherlands and the Scandinavian countries and other European countries, even compared to the Czech Republic, bigger gap. And if you look at some of the countries where the gap is smaller, they are countries which have more of the old social democratic safety net still intact, where there tends to be more uniformly available high-quality childcare, where there tends to be good support for housing, public health, et cetera, health insurance, and so forth. And some people say, well, the reason our literacy gap is so great is because we have so many immigrants. Well, it turns out when you separate the immigrants out, you disaggregate the immigrants, the relationship is still the same. We're not doing a good job with people born here. We're also not doing such a great job with newcomers.
Yeah, it's almost amazing how well we're doing with newcomers given the added challenge that they face. When you look at it, that 64% of the basic population of Caucasian kids growing up here are having the same. I mean, it's worse, but in our remaining time, what are the jewels that you would like? Suppose that you had people that were really concerned with adult literacy and they're paying great attention to you right now. they're listening to it, and you got to say, like, what are the jewels that you think would help them in terms of how to think about or formulate or orient themselves to be most helpful?
Well, I think that the first thing is that there are a lot of variations in this population, not just from beginning readers who tend to be pretty reading disabled and need a very intensive approach. One of the structured language approaches like Orton Gillingham or Wilson or Lindemood Bell or one of those that are expensive and highly technical. And even then, it's a struggle to take someone who's 45 years old and get them to the point where you're over that hump and they're really reading independently and not just sort of able to decode bus schedules and street signs. But there are a lot of, not just different levels of literacy from beginners all the way through GED, where they're ready to pass a high school equivalency exam. But even within that group of intermediate readers in the adult reader population, there are big profile differences. So you can find the person who has relatively strong meaning skills, vocabulary and comprehension, but has severe decoding problems. So that's one kind of profile. It kind of looks like this. And then you have another profile of the person who has really great decoding skills and print skills, but doesn't know enough words that they can decode. And then you also have some people who are kind of low and even. And slightly different approaches and emphases are needed for that. And so you can't go with a one-size-fits-all. And so it would be more work done on that, and that's what I and other people have been looking at a lot.
So that's almost a cycle back to remember that it's important to diagnose. Remember that it's important to assess. Remember that it's important to understand some kind of a profile or distribution of skills that can inform how you're helping. Exactly. You can have two people who have exactly the same measured ability in reading comprehension, but get there by very different routes. And unless you want them to stick there forever, you have to deal with the different patterns of strengths and needs. The assumption is that, I mean, I'm sort of a disciple of the Goff Perfetti, what Goff called the simple view of reading. If you can pronounce the symbols on the page and you know what they mean, that's 80% of comprehension. If you can do it fast enough that you're not spending a lot of time thinking about having done that.
And that's right. And indeed, Phil Goff, that's the next thing he says after that. And he's done a lot of research, and so is Perfetti, to show how those things interact. So there are a lot of roots to it, but if you don't deal with underlying categories of difficulties, this isn't going to budge much. So it's to kind of look beneath. Other than that, I think the other big point that keeps coming hammered home to me time after time is just that whatever we can do to head this problem off before adulthood, that's where the energy's got to go. As I said, so much pain and so many opportunities have been lost because people weren't able to succeed in school. And on the whole, the schools are certainly doing better now, because I get to meet people all the way from 70 years old down to 16 in my population. So it's very rare nowadays to find someone who was denied school, like would happen to rural African Americans in the South, or other just rural people in general in the U.S. Just didn't get to go. It was too hard to go. You only see that in the older people now. And increasingly, you almost never meet someone now who's born in the U.S. who hasn't at least had a diagnosis of reading disability, and someone has attempted to help them in some formal way in the schools. It may not have been perfect, may not have worked, but there's much more attention to that. And you can just see it. You can see clear-cut age definitions. If someone is younger than 50, which has to do with when in the 60s people started to be conscious of dyslexia and reading disability. If someone's younger than that, then chances are somebody noticed and they tried to get them help. So you do see shifts that are to the good. On the other hand, we seem to, for whatever reasons, be ending up with more curriculum casualties, to use Blackman's term, Benita Blackman's term, the kids you talked about on the NAEP that we're so worried about. I guess the other thing that worries me, and I think it's one of the reasons that people don't talk about much for the whole language revolution of the 70s, which in some ways did a lot of damage. But one of the things I think that led people into the whole language movement was the recognition that children were reading less outside of school. And it had to do just with the increasing stimulation of other things, I assume, television, video games. Yeah, that's right. Reading didn't compete as well. When I was a kid growing up in the 50s, and I grew up in a predominantly blue-collar neighborhood, we read. And I would go to the library with steelworkers' sons and so forth, and we'd fight with the librarian as to how many books she would let us take home in our bike basket, and television existed, but it was pretty lousy. There were only a couple hours on a day that would have been mildly interesting to children, and we just read for fun. And so you got to worry if less of that is going on. Given that reading is recursive, you got to feel that maybe back in my day, even the kids who were struggling had enough chances and desire to do it on the outside, that now it's not as much of a thing they would be apt to do.
I totally think the whole language thing. The good news is that human beings are meaning oriented.
Yeah.
We are meaning oriented, and that if we don't make what we're reading more meaningful, then our affective interest doesn't engage. And our cognition isn't going to do very good work if it's not. Yeah, and I think teachers noticed that kids were reading less, and they said, what can we do to get them more interested in reading and to be more interested in meaning? Is that this code isn't a natural thing. And that was the theoretical mistake made by the researchers in whole language. But I think the teacher's impulse started with a reality that we haven't dealt with yet, which is that kids are reading less. If reading is recursive and you read less, you weren't going to read as well, right? So, excellent. Thank you. One other thing, kind of closing on the